Dick Van Dyke did two completely different things in the public imagination, and somehow they got fused into one massive joke. First, he stepped in front of the cameras and gave movie history one of its most relentlessly mocked accents. His attempt at a Cockney rhythm in Mary Poppins became famous for entirely the wrong reasons. Audiences laughed at the performance, critics picked the sound apart, and people kept bringing the stumble up for years afterward. A weak line reading usually vanishes into the rest of a film, but a truly bad accent can become a permanent tag attached to a performer's name forever. It follows the actor, becoming an unavoidable part of the story people tell about their work. In his case, it became almost impossible to mention Mary Poppins without someone immediately bringing up that specific vocal miss. He became famous simply for being Dick Van Dyke, yet the accent stuck to his legacy because it was incredibly easy to isolate, imitate, and remember. The moment people hear his name and the movie title in the same breath, they think of the stumble almost before they think of anything else. You probably assume you know exactly why that performance failed. People often treat the accent as if it were a grand mystery, wondering how a major film production let such an obvious error slip through. They picture an American actor simply failing to grasp a foreign sound. But when the actual pieces of the production are laid out, the answer looks far less mysterious and deeply human. By his own account, Disney apparently gave him exactly one short training session to prepare for the massive role. He stepped into the film with incredibly thin guidance. To make matters worse, the coach they provided, J. Pat O'Malley, had an Irish background and did not actually model the Cockney sound well. An accent is not just vocabulary, it is rhythm, the shape of the sound, and exactly where the voice sits in the mouth. Because the person teaching the sound could not give the model clearly, the actor was already in severe trouble before he even opened his mouth on camera. Dick Van Dyke trusted the deeply flawed process and went to work, entirely unaware that his baseline instruction was wrong. Then the second part of the disaster unfolded, revealing a backstage secret that completely changes how you view the man. He was surrounded on set by a mostly British cast. Day after day, take after take, he spoke his lines out loud, yet absolutely no one pulled him aside and told him plainly that the accent sounded wrong. A room full of professionals heard the problem and deliberately chose to keep quiet. Decades later, Julie Andrews finally revealed the reason for the silence, offering an explanation that was both exceptionally kind and incredibly sharp. She told him nobody corrected the sound because he was working so incredibly hard. The cast saw his massive effort, his absolute commitment, and his relentless energy. They decided that correcting his voice would feel too cruel, choosing politeness and silence over causing him discomfort. In ordinary life, that kind of protection seems gentle, but on a film set, it becomes an incredibly costly mistake. Because everyone wanted to protect the actor from the harsh truth, the work itself never got fixed. Dick Van Dyke walked straight through that massive production blind spot, smiling and singing, leaving behind a permanent cultural joke simply because nobody around him possessed the nerve to say stop. That performance makes up the first half of the joke people tell about him. The second half arrives from a totally different direction, holding a secret that turns the entire story upside down. Genealogical sources reveal that his family line actually reaches straight back to the Mayflower generation. This is not just one old colonial ancestor tucked away in some dark, distant corner of a family tree. It is a massive cluster of names tied directly to one of the most familiar origin stories in American family history. His documented ancestry includes John Alden, Francis Cook, Peter Brown, George Soule, Miles Standish, Edward Doty, and Francis Eaton. Multiple family tree sources specifically trace his line back to Peter Brown, listing the passenger officially as his 9th great-grandfather. Those specific names carry immense weight because the Mayflower generation has become almost mythic in the national memory. The discovery connects a beloved modern entertainer directly to one of the oldest, most repeated origin stories in the entire country. When you put those two staggering facts together, the punchline instantly writes itself. The exact same man who got mercilessly teased for sounding badly English in a famous movie turns out to possess very old, deeply documented New England roots. The contrast feels almost too perfect, as if destiny set up a deliberate gag. People naturally want to draw a straight line between the two facts, hoping the ancient lineage somehow explains the failed accent, or that the failed accent points ironically back to the old lineage. They assume deep roots should magically produce some inherited ease with the sound and the old country style. You probably believe that bloodlines carry those kinds of traits forward. They do not. Family lines pass down names, physical bodies, documents, and stories. They absolutely do not pass down a working Cockney accent across hundreds of years of American living. The line reaching back to John Alden or George Soule does nothing to explain the Mary Poppins performance. Genealogy does not travel across the centuries acting as a hidden accent coach. His Mayflower descent is completely real in the genealogical sense, and his movie accent was still heavily mocked. The two facts sit awkwardly side by side, operating as neighbors in a joke rather than partners in a cause. If you hear the phrase Mayflower descendant, your mind likely jumps straight to the familiar slogan of landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620. That wording is a massive simplification, and simplifications are exactly where real ancestry stories drift into fake myths. The ship did not simply glide into a neat, symbolic spot called Plymouth Rock and finish the story in one single move. The vessel actually landed near Cape Cod first, and the Pilgrims only later settled at Plymouth. That historical difference tells you how easily family history gets flattened by fame. People want roots to explain absolutely everything about a person. They use phrases like more American as a dramatic flourish to describe his unusually deep colonial-era ancestry. But having a 9th great-grandfather named Peter Brown does not make Dick Van Dyke intrinsically more American than any other citizen whose family arrived later. The documentation simply means that if you trace one specific branch of his family backward, the paper trail runs very deep. You might wonder how a man could trace his bloodline back to colonial New England while carrying a name that sounds entirely different. The surname Van Dyke sounds Dutch, neat, and completely settled. It feels like the kind of label that should explain the entire family in one clean, straightforward line. When the Mayflower suddenly enters the picture, people get confused fast, wondering how a Dutch surname matches up with a passenger named John Alden. Surnames travel down one incredibly narrow path, while actual family ancestry spreads widely through all of them. He inherited Van Dyke directly from his father's paternal line. The deep Mayflower connection actually arrived entirely through his mother's side. Because families widen with every single generation, one surname can only ride a single rail through a massive web of histories. Surnames are deliberately built to stay highly visible, while maternal branches often carry the deepest history completely out of sight. His family tree actually holds English, Irish, and Scottish roots alongside the Dutch and colonial connections. Many people make the massive mistake of giving the surname too much power, letting one visible label swallow the rest of the family's reality. Dick Van Dyke proves that one person serves as a meeting place for countless different histories, carrying centuries of maternal legacy that never once stamped its name on the front door. Because his ancestry carries such immense historical weight, people quietly imagine that old bloodlines must automatically provide a safe, protected lane through modern life. You probably picture Mayflower descendants sitting in grand New England rooms, surrounded by old money, preserved status, and antique furniture. Dick Van Dyke's actual beginning shatters that exact fantasy without mercy. He did not begin his life in an ancient coastal town. He was born in West Plains, Missouri. He entered a completely modern, grounded 20th century American household. His father worked practical, demanding hours as a salesman. His mother spent her days working with words and typing as a stenographer. Absolutely nothing in his childhood setting pointed toward powdered wigs, preserved family rank, or an untouched colonial legacy. His starting image belonged entirely to the real economy of daily work, routine, and Midwestern middle-class striving. His birth circumstances reveal exactly what happens to ancient lines when history keeps moving forward. Centuries passed between the original Pilgrims and Dick Van Dyke's arrival in Missouri. Over those long generations, families scattered, branches split apart, descendants relocated inland, and fortunes constantly shifted. The great old names remained written in the tree, but they did not rise up to arrange his career or elevate his salesman father into a powerful social force. Many descendants of these famous colonial figures eventually became people the wider world simply never noticed again. Deep colonial ancestry does not guarantee wealth, and it certainly does not shield a family from the long, flattening force of time. That lack of guaranteed safety hit Dick Van Dyke directly, turning his early adult life into a story of brutal survival. If you think over 300 years of American history acts like a protective cushion, his early marriage provides a painful correction. He and his first wife, Margie, started their life together with a public event that sounded almost cinematic. They got married with the direct help of a radio show. That bright, festive opening felt incredibly lucky, acting like a gift from a brighter world. The beginning had an eager audience, but the suffering that immediately followed did not. The public glow of the radio show failed to pay their rent. The morning after the ceremony, the young couple faced the exact same terrifying questions that break ordinary people. Where will we sleep? And how long will the money actually hold? The reality of his early career hit them hard, proving to be deeply and painfully unstable. Despite possessing a family line documented for centuries, Dick Van Dyke faced the kind of immense financial pressure that leaves a young couple entirely without secure housing. The struggle eventually crossed a severe line, moving far beyond careful budgeting and straight into genuine crisis. They reached a devastating point where ordinary housing disappeared, forcing them to live inside a car for a while. Think about the sheer gravity of that image. A man carrying documented bloodlines back to John Alden and Miles Standish, sleeping in an automobile because he lacked the funds for a basic bed. That single fact cuts straight through the incredibly soft picture people carry of old American families. Time alone does not create wealth. A long paper trail cannot act as a bank account, and an old family name offers absolutely no shelter from the cold. His deep ancestry did not rescue him from the extreme instability of his early career. The family history remained old and traceable, while his money remained painfully short. No one can claim his hardship came from weak roots or a failure of legacy. His roots were remarkably old, yet his finances were still desperately hard. He stepped into marriage carrying hope, but he learned quickly that hope is not the same thing as income. Dick Van Dyke did not glide toward comfort on the strength of a famous name. He survived because he kept pushing through the intense danger of those unstable years using his own strength. He did not get to spend his ancestry. He had to live life exactly as it came, facing the plain danger of a shaky career alongside his wife. When he finally broke through the poverty and became famous, he did not achieve stardom because his bloodline carried him into view. He became a legend entirely because he built a massive career in entertainment that forced the public to notice his talent. That personal triumph completely reverses the way people usually think about family history. Usually, people imagine famous ancestors shining a bright light forward onto their later descendants. In this story, the light actually works completely backward. The line connecting him to the Mayflower sat quietly in the dark for generations, completely buried inside private records and specialist interest. The Pilgrims did not keep the family famous all the way into the 20th century. Instead, Dick Van Dyke's massive modern success created the reason for the spotlight to swing backward. His incredible stardom made people curious enough to go digging through the archives, suddenly asking where his family line actually went. He did not inherit the spotlight from his ancestors. His hard work gave his ancestors a brand new moment in the light. He stands as a living reminder that the past travels forward, but it rarely controls the outward details of the present. He spent years being remembered for one of the most famously bad accents in movie history, taking the fall for a rushed studio process and a quiet cast. He carried a Dutch surname that hid the massive colonial legacy resting squarely on his mother's side. He traced his blood back to the very origins of English settlement, yet he had to weather severe housing insecurity and sleep in a car just to survive his youth. None of those staggering facts cancel each other out. They all belong to the exact same man. The ancestors gave him a remarkable documented past, but they absolutely did not give him the career. He built that himself, making himself entirely unforgettable, and in the process, he pulled his forgotten family line straight out of the shadows and back into the center of the American story.